By 1882, some of London's water suppliers had been running sand filters for more than 50 years. In Dodge City, the drinking water came from the same creek where cattle herds crossed, and on warm mornings the smell drifted back into town before the bucket ever reached the well. A man in Dodge City in the summer of 1883 filled his bucket from the same source his neighbors had filled theirs for a decade. The water looked clear. It tasted like nothing in particular. He had no reason to suspect anything because the men who came before him had drunk from the same creek and most of them had survived. Clear does not mean clean. The people who built the frontier towns of the 1880s were not indifferent to water. They thought about it constantly. Water determined where a town was built, how large it could grow, and whether it would survive the summer. Town founders chose sites near creeks, rivers, or known springs. They dug wells. In dry country, they built cisterns to collect rain. Some towns passed ordinances designating upstream sections of the local creek as protected drinking water zones and prohibited livestock grazing within 100 yards of the bank. On paper, these rules would not have embarrassed an eastern city engineer. The problem was not ignorance of the need. The problem was everything else. The science of waterborne disease was new and contested. Robert Koch had identified the cholera bacterium in 1883, only 1 year before many of these towns reached their peak population. Carl Joseph Eberth had isolated the typhoid bacillus in 1880, just 3 years earlier. The knowledge was spreading slowly through the medical profession and had not yet reached the offices of most frontier town councils. Even in cities that already understood the cause, the infrastructure to act on it did not yet exist. No American city would chemically treat its water supply until 1908. The frontier doctor who arrived in your town in 1882 knew that bad water made people sick. What he could not tell you was which water, or why the dangerous kind, looked exactly the same as the kind that did not kill you. Walk to the edge of town. Every cattle town has an edge that ends at water. There is a bank. There is a path worn into it by use, by hooves, by the morning routine of 100 households. The creek is there, and it is moving, and it looks like what water is supposed to look like. What you cannot see from the bank is what happened upstream. The cattle trails of the 1870s and 1880s moved herds of between 1,000 and 3,000 animals along routes that followed water. The Chisholm Trail, the Western Trail, the Goodnight Loving Trail all tracked the same creek systems that the towns along them depended on for drinking. Charles Goodnight, who co-founded that last trail with Oliver Loving in 1866 and drove it for 2 decades, wrote in his later memoirs that the entire route had been planned around water sources. Every stop was a water stop. Every water stop was a place where a herd of 1,000 animals crossed, drank, and moved on. When a drive crossed a creek, the cattle waded through it. They fouled it. A herd of 2,000 longhorns crossing a 50-foot creek in August left behind a level of contamination that took days to disperse. The towns downstream had no testing system, no warning, and no alternative supply. They drew water anyway because there was nothing else. In the summer of 1871, an estimated 700,000 longhorns moved north along the Chisholm Trail through Kansas alone. Every crossing used the same creek systems the towns depended on for drinking. 700,000 animals. The same water. Every crossing left the water downstream changed for days. The town had no way to know a drive had passed, and no way to wait. Would you have known when to drink and when to wait? Tell me in the comments. That is the world you wake up in every morning. Now consider what happens when the water wins. Dysentery killed more people in these towns than gunfights ever did. It just did not come with a legend. Everything you know about how dangerous the Old West was came from stories about outlaws and gunfighters. No one ever made a living writing about bowel fever. But bowel fever, typhoid, and cholera moved through the same water that every household drew from each morning, and they killed, silently, in back rooms, in the middle of summer, without anyone who survived talking about it afterward. Typhoid fever travels in water contaminated by human waste. In the 1880s, frontier town, outhouses were dug into the ground within yards of the same wells that supplied drinking water. The contamination ran in both directions. Upstream fouled downstream. The outhouse near the well fouled every household that drew from it. There was no separation. There was no system. There was only the distance between where people produced waste and where they collected water. And in most frontier towns, that distance was measured in feet. The mortality rate for typhoid fever was between 10 and 20%. For every 10 people in a frontier town who contracted it from a contaminated source, 1 or 2 would not recover. The rest would spend weeks prostrated, a clinical term that meant the infection had stripped a working person of everything they needed to function. A cowhand who could not ride was a liability the outfit had no room for. In 1891, Chicago recorded 174 deaths per 100,000 people from typhoid in a single year. That was its worst year on record, and Chicago had hospitals, doctors, and more infrastructure than any cattle town could match. Frontier towns had fewer doctors, no sewage system, no water testing, and the same open sources. Many of their deaths went unrecorded. The ones that were not written down were simply not counted. Dysentery ran alongside typhoid through the same water routes. Frontier physicians recorded cases lasting 4 to 6 weeks, during which the patient could not work, could not eat without consequence, and could not leave the vicinity of whatever passed for a toilet. In a cattle camp with a drive schedule to meet, there was no accommodation for a man who could not ride. And it was not only the cattle towns that drew from these fouled sources. The same problem ran through every army post in the Southwest, documented in detail by the men who were supposed to prevent it. John Gregory Bourke graduated from the United States Military Academy at West Point in 1869 and spent the next 2 decades on active duty in the American West. He rode with General George Crook through the Apache campaigns in Arizona and the Sioux campaigns on the northern plains. He took careful notes on everything he observed. In 1891, he published On the Border with Crook, which remains one of the most thorough first-hand accounts of daily life in the frontier West, including the water and sanitary conditions at the posts where he served. In his notes, Bourke described the standard water arrangement at frontier posts across the Southwest. The post drew its drinking water from a creek or river. The same waterway, upstream or adjacent, received the drainage from the post's own waste disposal, from the horse corrals, from the cookhouse runoff. The source and the contamination were the same water moving in the same direction. Army records from the period show that in years without active combat, more soldiers at frontier posts died from gastrointestinal disease than from any other cause. Not arrows, not bullets, water. You fill your canteen from the creek outside the fort walls. It is cold. It is moving. It looks exactly like water is supposed to look. You have been drinking from this source for 6 months, and you are still alive, and that feels like evidence that the water is safe. It is not evidence. It is luck, and this morning yours may have changed. Now move from the fort to the town. Move from the post to the general store. You are standing in front of the water barrel near the entrance. It is the summer of 1885. There is a ladle hanging from its side. You use it, the same way the man before you used it, and the man before him. The barrel was filled this morning from the creek at the edge of town. The creek runs clear because it rained 3 days ago, and the sediment has settled. You cannot see what settled with it. Typhoid travels in water that looks exactly like this. So does cholera. So does every pathogen that killed people in these towns, at rates that far exceeded gunfights, outlaws, and every other cause the frontier myth chose to remember. The first American city to chemically treat its water supply was Jersey City, New Jersey, in 1908. That is not a frontier date. That is 18 years after the United States Census Bureau officially declared the frontier closed. For the entire span of the American Old West, from the California Gold Rush of 1849 to the last cattle drives of the early 1890s, not one American town had treated drinking water. The knowledge of what the water carried arrived in the 1880s. The means to remove it arrived in 1908. In the years between those two dates, people shared their water source with horses, with cattle herds of thousands, and with the animals that died in the creek and were left where they fell. You drink. The water tastes like nothing. It always tastes like nothing. The gap between knowing and fixing was nearly 30 years. For every person alive in those cattle towns during that gap, the water never changed. If that is the kind of history you want to understand, subscribe. There is more coming. These were not careless people. They were operating at the outer edge of what was known, in places where the map was still being drawn as they walked across it. They carried water miles across the desert when the creek went dry. They boiled it when something made them suspicious, even without fully understanding what boiling destroyed. They built cisterns where they could afford them. In the 1880s and early 1890s, several towns in Kansas and Nebraska relocated entirely because the water source that had drawn settlers to the site had either dried up or become untenable. They did not abandon the West. They moved the West to where the water still ran. The people who drank from those creeks and survived, and most of them did survive, were not simply fortunate. Their bodies had been tested and rebuilt, season by season, by the same water that killed their neighbors. They endured conditions that would put most modern adults in a hospital within a week, and they called it an ordinary Tuesday. The creek that ran through their town looked exactly like clean water. The creek is still at the edge of town. The bucket is still on the bank, worn into the earth by years of the same motion, lowered each morning by the same routine. The water comes up cold and clear, the same as it did yesterday and the week before. Somewhere upstream, the herd has crossed. The bucket is full.